Test. Hello again. I think I see a lot of familiar faces, excited to be back up here and in a totally different context, not telling a founding story, not talking about philosophies on business, but asking for your help in thinking about the application of some technologies that we've been developing here. And I just want to echo some of the things that Kyle Dodson said about the reason that at least Beta is here in town, and it has a lot to do, and not to keep harping on rocks and rust, but 2 seconds of our background, and you'll see how this leads into the conversation on connectivity of rural communities, is that we started this business here in Burlington, and we did some internal fundraising. Myself, other people in the business, put some dough in to get us over our first hump. It's part of the deal in starting startup businesses. You don't start with a whole lot of cash coming in the door and then start shipping things. You have to start shipping things after you get some investment and people to believe in you. Rob Blair and Rust walked into our facility, and they took the lead on our very first financing round, put their own dough in, and catalyzed a whole lot of local investors to put some money in. And somewhere near $800+ million later in investment, we've got 500 people working here in Vermont towards the mission of creating sustainable aviation in the future. So a shout out to them, not only for creating a place like this, but also behind the scenes, planting the seeds for us and other companies to get started here in Vermont. And I contrast that with a whole number of other philosophies and venture capitalists and other people who came to us and offered to help us grow our business. And I have this very vivid memory of one venture capitalist walking in, and he had an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. He put it on the table, and he showed me this map, this big S curve. And he said, show me on this map where you're gonna move and when you're gonna exit. And I looked at him and I spun it around and I slid it back to him. I said, we're not moving and there's no exit. I'm doing this because I love what I'm doing in a place that we love doing it. So this isn't gonna work. And he left. And ironically, he came back a few years later in a different venture capital firm and felt like he missed a trade. But that's his business, right? And we have countless examples of people, contrary to what Kyle just gave the example of a venture capitalist, recognizing that there's a lot of smart people outside of Austin and Boston and Silicon Valley that are working on hard problems and solving them. And when we get pulled to go to these places where there's better talent and there's more access to capital and there's better advisement, I think resisting that offers some really unique benefits. It also gives us the ability in this context to think about different problems. Our business is exactly in that place where this recognition that every other mode of transportation has gone electric and aviation sits out there being a horrific polluter. We as aviators operate in this cognitive dissonance of goodness. Meanwhile, and by the way, a huge milestone 2 weeks ago, the FAA universally approved unleaded fuel for airplanes across the board. It was a big deal. We're not dumping lead into the atmosphere anymore by using the right fuel. Nowhere near enough, right? But we all recognize that electric aviation was technologically possible. We could use batteries, fuel cells, other means of storage, couple that with smart power electronics, with advanced motors, and get an air into the sky doing useful work with zero operational emissions. The next question is, how are you building the plane? How are you generating electricity? But let's start with zero operational emissions. Now, if we were in Silicon Valley or if we're in Boston or Austin, the obvious application is to create an air taxi. We're going to jump over the traffic. That's the only logical thing to do with an airplane that takes off and lands vertically and is all electric and quiet and got rid of the need for an airport. However, us being in Vermont, we had a completely different perspective on the thing. Like, I live in Lincoln, lived in Underhill before. There's a couple stoplights between here and there. On top of mind was not jumping over traffic. But what was on top of mind is the fact that we get a lot of goods shipped to us, and we ship a lot of goods, right? A company really can't be competitive in Vermont or the Northeast Kingdom or in Rutland unless they play outside of their, I shouldn't say successful, can't be successful outside of hyper-local markets unless they play in e-commerce. And that means they're sending things out and they're getting things to us. We recognize this as a problem. We uniquely found, as Martine Rothblatt, one of my mentors, says, a corridor of relative indifference, and we ran like hell down it. which was, let's go after cargo and logistics while everybody is circling the same light bulb of air taxis. And we did, and we differentiated ourselves, and it defined our business right out of the gates. And the interesting thing is that when we thought about why that was a more insightful place to operate than our competitors, it was because we need tailwinds as startup businesses. We need people to care about sustainability in our business. We need people to recognize that there's so we've got a reason for being. There has to be a transformative change there, and people recognize it. We need a technology that works. We need a market fit to accept that technology. But the tailwind that we realized that everybody else wasn't capitalizing on, traffic has been there forever. I mean, for a long time, right? But this logistics issue that we're facing right now of moving goods around the world is a relatively new problem. It has exploded recently, and it's brought certain industries to a halt. And we are offering a potential solution to that. Meanwhile, people are moving out of cities. People are recognizing that remote work works, that they can start businesses. And here I go down the thought process that I intended to talk about before listening to Kyle Dodson up here a second ago, which is a few years ago, as in 10, 20 years ago, the internet stopped connecting defense bases, NASA centers, and universities, and it started to connect all of us to information. And that was wildly transformative. People were better educated about the world, their health. They could operate businesses remotely. And this intellectual property transfer and this information transfer completely changed the way that we look at the world. And us right now, a good portion of the world, by the way, doesn't really get access to that yet. And we need to make sure that they get access to that. The next transformative shift is going to be, how are we going to efficiently not move data, but how are we going to move goods, services, people? How are people going to continue to see their loved ones? How are they going to move their things that they've designed, built, or an artisan in the Northeast Kingdom, get that out to the world in an efficient way that's competitive with these massive arteries that connect cities together? And that's where we believe our solution may have some legs. And I'm up here today asking you guys to think about what those legs look like. What problems should we be addressing with the technologies that we've developed? How can we do it within the mission of our business? And how do we make Vermont, other rural communities? And by the way, we aren't that rural. I mean, some of you, you've been up to northern Canada or to sub-Saharan Africa. We're not rural. There's places that have a bigger need for access to healthcare and to move their goods and to increase their quality of life and their lifespan and education more so than us. But let's use us as an example because we understand it. And this clicker isn't working, so you may want to advance the slides, whoever's running those. Let's skip right over the top of this one. And I'm going to talk to you about, well, let's just fire through these. So, healthcare is a big one that I think we should start considering. Let's hit the next one. And 2 forward, please. Uh-oh, too many questions. All right, let's go to one more here. And basically, and I think at least a subset of the people here know what Beta is endeavoring to do. We want to get rid of the 3 most annoying things in airplanes: the runway, the fuel, and the noise. And when you do that, you move back up the logistics train. And so, like, if you imagine this big bell curve, and way over here, people aren't willing to spend a lot of money, and they don't care if it takes 6 months for their product to get here. Right in the middle, everybody wants something in a month or 2 weeks. It's restocking shelves at stores or whatever. And way over here, you've got people that are willing to pay for overnight delivery. They're willing to pay for it, but the volume is small because it's very expensive. What if you took that and you said, I'm going to make it less expensive and more sustainable, which in our case, by the way, the sustainability tracks the economics, because really moving things is all about energy. And if you reduce the amount of energy you're using moving things, then you're going to be more sustainable and you're going to be lower cost all at the same time. There is no, Bill Gates green premium here. You're actually walking back up that curve. And you're walking up a curve that's not linear. It's highly nonlinear. And you're accessing a much larger market at a very low cost to moving goods and people and other things. So The way we've attempted to attack that is by building in this case, a complete domestic charging network for electric aircraft. The pilot training systems that allow pilots to fly this near term in the plane, after that remotely from the plane, and after that just as engineers who let the thing do its thing by itself. And the third piece of the puzzle is the aircraft itself. And we started by building a vertical takeoff and landing all electric aircraft that has the capability of bypassing massive congested hubs. I think in the energy sector, a lot of people have heard of distributed generation, and they know the inefficiencies of large transmission and distribution. And if you have solar on your house, if you produce 30 kilowatts, or let's say 5 kilowatts of average power on a 30 kilowatt array at your house, that gets utilized at a much higher efficiency than something that's generated up at Hydro-Quebec, goes 4 stages of transformation before it gets pumped down here, then put into distribution, and finally gets to your house. It's more efficient to use it at the point. It's also true in a shipping network, where if we ship something here from Burlington to Buffalo, New York, it goes usually to Williston, and then it goes on a package car, and it goes over to the airport. They unload this thing, they throw it on a little turboprop plane, it flies down to Manchester. In Manchester, it gets repackaged on a pallet, it gets put on a 757. It goes down to Philadelphia, where they add some more pallets to it, then goes to Louisville, where it goes in this place called Worldport, where they sort 8 million packages over the course of 3 hours. They all get unloaded, they get sorted, they get put back into pallets, they're put on big jets, and then they go back to another city. Let's say it's going to Buffalo. It actually goes to Buffalo. It gets unloaded from the jet, it gets sorted out into package cars, it goes to the distribution center, it gets resorted, it gets put back on a package car, and it goes out to where it's going. There's 5 to 7 steps of moving things. And by the way, that package just moved like 1,400 miles in order for it to go 150 miles. It's wasteful, it takes a lot of time, there's time in transit. And what's interesting about rural communities is they get the short end of the stick here. Because if you were just going Philly to Buffalo, you'd eliminate those first 4 steps, right? So a seller of wares in Philly can now take an order up until 10 o'clock at night and still get it the next day to Buffalo, where the person in Northeast Kingdom had to have their orders in by 4 p.m. And all of us as consumers are saying, if my mother-in-law's birthday is tomorrow, I'm probably not going to order something by 4 o'clock. It's probably going to be like 9:30 at night before I think of it. So that's a disadvantage to everybody who's trying to be competitive in these rural communities. And on the flip side, a business or an individual that's looking to receive something, we know how that works. Prime isn't, same day here. It is in a lot of cities, and we don't hear about it a lot. And by the way, Amazon assesses us right here in this town as rural, which is interesting. So it's wildly inefficient the way we move things. So with a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, you can make that entire trip, especially when you size it appropriately, by just hopping over that entire convoluted network of hub and spoke systems. And if anybody's sitting there saying, geez, that sounds a lot like the way we used to go to libraries, and now we talk directly to servers and websites, right? There's this great corollary between the internet and now what we're looking at, the physical internet of moving things around. And I don't know if this is the solution, but it's an idea. And I would love it for you guys to think about it a little bit. Whoever has the slides, let's pop a couple more forward. And these are just some pretty pictures to show that this thing works. So that we went backwards. This is flying vertically. So basically, it's all electric. So you have no turbine engine noise. You have no reciprocating engine noise. And while it's flying forward, if you can go back one slide, whoever's running this, while it's flying forward, it is a super efficient electric airplane. And just for context, this pushing itself through the air is using about 130 kilowatts of power, moving at about 120 knots. And while it's doing that, it's carrying somewhere between, let's say, 600 and 2,000 pounds of payload. That's more efficient than driving a full F-150 truck around in things. And not only is it more efficient, it's not going on this route, right? It's going on this route. And by the way, something we don't think about a lot, and I'm just kind of riffing on the sustainability and the impact that we make on the world when we do this stuff. When we bisect environments, habitats with roads and fences, and we totally just slice through biodiversity of microorganisms and stuff, we're having some effect that's immeasurable on our ultimate sustainability as humans. We don't have to build roads, maintain roads, salt roads, drive big trucks on them, police roads when we're flying in the air, right? And contrary to a lot of beliefs, we hit way more birds driving on the road than we do flying at 8,000 to 10,000 feet. Just to put that out there, because I've heard that argument a few times. So let's go forward a couple slides here. And I kind of blew through this. Let's go to the next slide here. So this is what a hub and spoke model looks like today. Things come together to these somewhat, I would say, regional hubs, ultimately to very centric hubs. And this is you can kind of ignore some of the data and just imagine that everything comes together and goes back out. And if we can advance the slides one here. If you create a mesh network, I think the obvious thing that people are going to latch on to is, wow, there's a lot more routes there. There's a lot more routes there, so maybe the routes shouldn't be as big, right? And so now we go back to the sustainability of an asset. When I look at a 757 operating in a hub and spoke network, it flies twice a day. One of the reasons is it's really expensive to fly. The other reason is it's really big, so there's only so much stuff to carry. So we've got to maintain and house and build and do all those things with that massive 757 for it to sit most of the day. If we have a network that's built on things that are smaller, then the impact that we're making by building the asset, like an airplane, it may carry the same weight, but it's going all day long, for example. And it's doing it with zero operational emissions. And like one of our customers elegantly says is, you know, when we have a big asset where the OpEx dominates the CapEx, we're going to find just the things that really need to sweat that asset or to use the OpEx portion of it, because it's really expensive on a per hour basis and it's nominally expensive on a capital basis. If you flip that equation on its head and you make the operational expense or the recurring expense of using an asset infinitesimally small relative to its capital expenditure, then you say, well, how often can I use it? Because my incremental cost is almost irrelevant. And I'm just giving you these thoughts so we can start to think about not just the dimension of what tool we use to improve rural connectivity, but how do we use that tool? And how do we rethink the utilization of that tool? Never mind what's the best application of that tool. And just kind of rewinding back to the beginning, thinking about healthcare, thinking about education and access, thinking about the things that make a lot of sense for these communities. And the last comment I'll make, and then I'll retire my thinking, at least for a minute, it's we as consumers, maybe not everybody in this room, because there's probably a lot of entrepreneurs here, always think on the receiving end of logistics networks. But as a business, we consolidate that thinking to maybe the shipping department, but they do a lot of thinking and they're actually a major consumer of logistics. Think about the outgoing portion of this, the place where the things are made, the place where things are modified, the different types of stuff that we would want to move with a relative urgency directly between places. I was going to say I was going to retire, but I've got 2 minutes and 38 seconds remaining. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. Mississippi is the largest consumer of IFR helicopters in the country on a per capita basis. They've got 2 primary hospitals and 11 satellite hospitals. Stroke medication, by the way, that lasts about 30 days costs almost $30,000. And when a loved one has a stroke, you don't care how much it costs, right? If you're going to somehow, alleviate that whatever's blocking the blood. And you need to get that stroke medication. I get this weird acoustic standing over there. It's not because I don't like you. So they keep this in 2 centralized locations. And when a patient's coming in with a stroke, they launch a helicopter with a little vial to get it out there because they can't support, N number of medicines or antivenoms at all these different places that expire in a very short period of time, even when they're refrigerated and all that kind of stuff. So it's really important to move that stuff really quickly, and that's an extreme case, right? And they launch a helicopter to go do that because, airplanes don't go point to point. Drones don't have the range to hit all these things because the smaller the aircraft, the physics say, the lower the range in general. And it's incredibly wasteful and very expensive. And Mississippi is also the highest dependency on Medicare to Medicare. So they're consuming a lot of resources to do something in a rural place. They also have geographic limitations where many days that delta is completely filled with fog. So they need an aircraft or something that can fly IFR, hence IFR, which means we're consuming 2 pilots. We're consuming a pretty advanced helicopter. We're blowing a lot of diesel fuel to move these things around. And that's the type of application where I think the value of just taking the cost and cutting it in an 1/8 or a 1/10 or a 20th and increasing the service makes sense. But there are much more insightful things that have a larger impact on society than positioning a couple aircraft in hospitals in Mississippi. So 30 seconds remaining and I am done, I think.